Thank you very much, and let me thank at the beginning Simeon and his wonderful team to invite us again for a second time. It's wonderful to be back here in Delphi. It's a bit of a challenge to speak at the end of a panel and at the end of almost the end of a conference after Nobel laureates and professors and ministers and former ministers, etc., and to add anything that hasn't been said. But it also provides an opportunity, which is to be completely complementary and not to repeat what everybody else has said. So I'm going to try and do that and only say three things. But in so doing, we've seen the panel go sort of from macro to fiscal to revenue to investment to now a very concrete investment, which I think is very educational, and I'll come back to it. I'm going to zoom out again a little bit, if I may, for a moment, and I hope you don't get dizzy in the process. So what I would like to talk about is a bit of an echo of what you heard before, which is from stabilization to investment and growth. For Greece. I would like to use, in so doing, I'd like to use a medical metaphor, if I may. This is the equivalent from stabilization to growth of moving the patients from the ER, from the emergency room to physiotherapy. What do I mean? If we go back to 2009 and 10, if we take the Greek economy as the patient was hemorrhaging and was under a lot of stress. There was talk of Brexit, there was talk of contagion at that time, so the patient was put into the emergency room and was treated by the emergency room doctors. So let's see a few years forward, in 8 years later, how is the patient doing? Well, the first good news is the patient is alive, and the patient is stable, and contagion to the European family hasn't happened. So that's a big success. But this success has come at a huge economic and social cost. The economic cost is here. You may have seen this chart before. The red line, for those of you in the back, is the Greek economy, GDP. And then we have a comparison with the Asian crisis, the Eurozone crisis in general, and the US Great Depression. And of course, the red line down there, which is still hovering around 75%, is the Greek economy. So the first bad news is the patient has lost 25% of body weight. And before one of you makes the joke, let me make it first. The patient hasn't only lost fat, the patient has also lost meat and muscle, and this is a problem. The second consequence is a social one. This crisis and the impact has led to a very sharp increase in what they call the anchored poverty rate, and that is essentially measures how many people live below the median, 60% of the median income. And this is anchored in 2008, so you can see what happened. And essentially what this chart tells you is that at that point, the poverty rate since then has gone up from 20% to a staggering 48% in that period of time. And you see the other lines are Spain, Italy, Portugal, so you see how they've weathered the crisis at the same time. So the patient finds himself, herself impoverished. So what does that mean now going forward? It does mean, and this is again an echo of something that you've heard before, we are of the opinion that the process of stabilization and adjustment has been very, very successful, but we now need to urgently shift gear towards physiotherapy, and we need to move into the next era. This is easier said than done, and I'm going to talk about only two areas specifically because you've heard many areas of structural reform, etc., that are necessary, but I want to only mention two. But I do want to mention at the outset, of course, the analogy with the medical metaphor also holds for ownership. As in the medical field, the patient needs to of course, own up to the diagnosis and then also own up to the therapy and do his share or her share in the process. But what would the doctor prescribe at this point? And before you tell me I can't count, I know there are 3 points here. I'm only going to talk about two. The first one I'm not going to talk about, make it easier to invest. Many of you have talked about this, heard about this yesterday and today. There were a lot of good points mentioned. I will only highlight two that we're involved in an advisory capacity, and that is the investment licensing reform, very, very important for companies to make it easier to invest and to operate. And secondly, the area of cadastre reform, which most of you know is a very complex one in Greece, and we're involved in that as well. But let me talk a minute each about making labor more employable and addressing the growing poverty and making better use of geography. What we mean here is if you look at the unemployment situation, and we just heard from Thessaloniki and the Thrace region. Unemployment, of course, as you know, is very high, 20%, 47% among youth. But what is worse, if you take that cohort and you look at how many of those are long-term unemployed, it is 70% of the active job seekers, 72% that are long-term unemployed. That's 12 months and longer. And the international experiences is that if you have people that are long-term unemployed, it becomes more and more difficult to reattach them to the labor market, reintegrate them, and their wage prospects looking forward are lowered. So this is a degradation, if you like, a disinvestment. Since we're talking about investment, this is an investment, a disinvestment in human capital. And so we need to stop that process rapidly and reverse it and make sure that labor, human capital is employable. So when demand picks up in Greece, in Europe, in the world, that we actually get a supply response, because if we don't have the human capital, we're not going to see a supply response. So this is very important, and addressing growing poverty, this is being done currently through the social solidarity income, and we're privileged to be involved in that in an advisory capacity as well. It went for a national launch, of course, as you know, at the beginning of the month. It is going quite successfully. The last point is on making better use of geography. And I was reminded of this when, I'm not going to talk about tourism, I was reminded of this when I was here last time in Delphi. And at that last time, for those of you who were here, the forum was really dominated by the issue of refugees and migration at that time. That was the time of the big wave. So I was sitting there and thinking, what does that have to do with economic growth? How do you connect those two things? And then it dawned on me. I said, why do refugees and migrants know something about the geographic location of Greece that goods don't seem to know, or traders of goods, right? Because what happens is, as you may know, in the port of Piraeus, is 90% transshipment, which means that you have ships coming in from Asia into Europe, and 90% of the volume goes from a big ship out of China onto a smaller ship that goes to Italy and to Rotterdam and Hamburg. Good for them, but the problem is that only 10% of the goods actually enter the market, are further processed, manufacturing, and further transported into the market. This is a big waste of an asset, which is geographic location. So we need to work on the logistics sector in this area. We need to work urgently on the transport corridor through the Western Balkans. It takes, since the dismantlement of Yugoslavia, it takes too long, it is too expensive to get through the corridor. And I remember one of the managing directors of Costco mentioned to me once that Greece and Piraeus, the port of Piraeus, could be cost competitive for containers all the way up to the Czech Republic, and could beat the ports of Hamburg and Rotterdam if only the rail corridor could be fixed. So here's a positive challenge, and I'll leave on a really positive note. Most people have said that structural reforms are painful. Well, the logistics sector is a sector that is underdeveloped in Greece. So the resistance is in the port of Hamburg and in Rotterdam. So let's go for it. Thank you very much for your attention.